My name is Thomas, and if you've been listening to me for a while, you know I'm obsessed with secrets buried in the past. Not just ancient bones or forgotten villages, though Eldoria still sends shivers down my spine. Lately, my mind has been caught on a different kind of quiet, a chilling silence that fell over a place called Elmwood Asylum, way back in the 1930s. My grandpa, the amazing paleontologist who usually digs up dinosaurs, has a secret passion for old, forgotten buildings, especially ones with dark stories. He calls them architectural ghosts. And Elmwood, he says, is one of the biggest, most puzzling ghosts of them all. 53 patients, gone. Without a single record of where they went. Just, vanished. Elmwood Asylum wasn't just a building, it was a fortress, a hulking mass of dark stone that sat perched on a lonely hill, overlooking a dense, perpetually shadowed forest. It was built in the late 1800s, a time when people thought locking away those with troubled minds was the best way to help them. The architectural style was what Grandpa called Victorian Gothic, which basically means it looked like a giant, spooky castle. It had tall, narrow windows that seemed to stare out like empty eyes, and a roofline bristling with sharp gables and chimneys that resembled skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. Even on the sunniest days, a perpetual gloom seemed to cling to its stone walls, like a shadow that refused to leave. The very air around it felt heavy, thick with unspoken stories. Local folks, even generations later, still spoke of Elmwood in hushed tones. They called it the Stone Cage or the House of Whispers. Rumors swirled around it like mist on the valley floor. Stories of strange lights in the upper windows at night, of muffled screams carried on the wind, and of the distant, mournful cries that some swore could be heard on moonless nights. Most people in the nearby small town of Blackwood avoided the road that led up to Elmwood Hill, even years after it had closed. They preferred to keep their distance, their fear rooted not just in the building's imposing presence, but in the chilling, unexplained event that cemented its place in local folklore, the disappearance of 53 souls, without a trace, in the bleak winter of 1934. The official records are frustratingly sparse, almost as if someone wanted the details to be forgotten. What little is known comes from fragments of old newspaper articles and the terrified testimony of a few remaining staff members who were on duty that fateful night. The asylum operated under the strict, often harsh, practices common for mental institutions of that era. Patients were admitted, often against their will, and rarely left. They were housed in large, impersonal wards, and their days were governed by a rigid routine of meals, walks in the enclosed courtyard, and various treatments that, by today's standards, would be considered barbaric. Yet, for all its sternness, Elmwood was known for its order. It was a place of strict discipline, overseen by a stern, unsmiling director named Dr. Alistair Finch, a man who believed in keeping meticulous records of every patient, every treatment, every single detail. That's what makes the vanishing so utterly baffling. The night of January 17, 1934, was bitterly cold, with a thick layer of fog clinging to Elmwood Hill, making the already isolated asylum feel even more cut off from the world. Dr. Finch, as was his habit, conducted his final rounds before midnight, checking on each ward, ensuring all patients were accounted for, and all doors were securely locked. He was known for his almost obsessive attention to detail, especially regarding patient counts. He even initialed the patient log himself every night. That night, the log showed 212 patients. The next morning, Nurse Eleanor Vance, a diligent and somewhat timid woman who had worked at Elmwood for 15 years, was the first to realize something was terribly wrong. Her usual morning routine involved a precise count of patients in the East Wing. She counted them once, then again, then a third time, her brow furrowed in confusion. The numbers weren't adding up. She reported her findings, her voice trembling, to the head nurse, who in turn alerted Dr. Finch. Panic, slow and creeping at first, then escalating into a frenzied chaos, gripped Elmwood. Dr. Finch, usually composed and logical, turned pale as he himself began counting. They moved from ward to ward, every doctor, every nurse, every orderly, frantically counting and recounting. The results were always the same, chillingly consistent. 53 patients were missing. Not from one ward, but from several. They hadn't escaped en masse from a single dormitory, they had vanished from different parts of the sprawling, labyrinthine building. And the most terrifying detail, there was no sign of how they had left. The asylum's formidable perimeter was intact. The high stone walls, topped with barbed wire, showed no breaches. Every gate was locked, every window barred. The internal doors, which required heavy keys, were also found locked from the inside or undisturbed. There were no broken windows, no smashed locks, no signs of a struggle. It was as if 53 people, each confined by walls and iron, had simply dematerialized. Their rooms were untouched. Personal belongings, a worn photograph, a neatly folded blanket, a half-finished needlepoint, remained exactly where they had been left. Meals had been laid out for breakfast in the dining hall, the porridge growing cold, waiting for mouths that would never arrive. It was a scene of eerie, suspended animation, a snapshot of life abruptly paused, the actors gone. Sheriff Thorne, the same gruff but honest sheriff from the Eldoria mystery, was called in. He arrived with a team of deputies, their faces grim, clearly unnerved by the stories that preceded them and the unnatural silence that met them at the asylum gates. They conducted a thorough, painstaking search of the entire building, from the deepest, dampest cellars to the highest, dustiest attics. They meticulously scoured the surrounding grounds, the dense forest, and even the frozen river that snaked through the valley below. They questioned every living staff member, pushing them for any detail, any anomaly, any strange occurrence from the previous night. But everyone stuck to the same story, a quiet, unremarkable night, followed by the shocking discovery of emptiness. There were no screams reported, no alarms triggered, no suspicious figures seen lurking in the fog. The lack of any tangible evidence was what truly deepened the mystery. No footprints in the snow outside the walls, no torn fabric on the barbed wire, no discarded patient uniforms. It defied every logical explanation for a mass disappearance. If it had been an escape, there would have been a trail. If it had been an abduction, there would have been signs of a struggle, forced entry, or at the very least, a commotion. But there was nothing. Just the chilling void where 53 human beings had been just hours before. And the meticulous logbook, Dr. Finch's pride and joy, contained only the entry of 212 patients at midnight, followed by a blank space. No record of discharge, no transfer, no death, no escape. They were simply gone. Grandpa showed me a grainy newspaper clipping from the time, the headline screaming "Asylum Mystery, 53 Vanish into Thin Air." The accompanying article was full of speculation, hints of madness, and a creeping sense of dread. For me, this wasn't just a historical event, it was a ghost story with real people as the ghosts. Who were these 53 patients? What were their names? What were their stories before they became a number in a cold case? And more importantly, what really happened to them? The thought of so many lives, so many individual stories, just evaporating into the frigid night air without a trace, without a word, was a mystery that gripped me tighter than any fiction. I knew then that Elmwood Asylum wasn't just an old building, it was a giant, locked box, and I was going to try my best to find the key. The newspaper clippings and official records were a good starting point, but they were just the bare bones of the story, cold facts without any heart. To really understand what happened at Elmwood Asylum, I knew I had to dig deeper, to move beyond the headlines and try to get a sense of the place itself. My grandpa helped me find some old photographs taken by a journalist a few weeks after the vanishing. They weren't just of the outside of the building, but of the inside too. They were grainy and black and white, but they showed the stark, sterile reality of life at Elmwood. I saw the long, empty hallways, their floors polished to a mirror-like shine. I saw the dining hall, the long wooden tables arranged in neat rows, the chairs pushed in, and the breakfast bowls still sitting there, as if waiting. The most haunting photos were of the patient rooms. They were Spartan, with a simple cot, a small wooden locker, and a single, barred window. In one photo, a neatly folded blanket lay on a cot, a tiny, hand-carved wooden bird sitting on top of it. In another, a small book was open face down on a nightstand, its pages frozen in time. These weren't just objects, they were the last pieces of a life, the last whispers of a person who was there one minute and gone the next. The sheer ordinariness of it all was what made it so terrifying. There was no chaos, no destruction. Just a silent, empty space where life used to be. The investigation, as my grandpa and I pieced it together from old reports, was a study in frustration. Sheriff Thorne, the same man who had been so baffled by the Eldoria vanishing, found himself facing an even more impenetrable wall of silence. The asylum's perimeter was his first point of focus. He sent men to walk every inch of the stone walls, to check every lock on every gate. They found no breaches, no signs of anyone climbing over. The heavy iron gates were all securely chained and locked. Inside, the story was the same. The doors to the various wings were all locked, and no windows were broken. It was a closed system, and yet, 53 people had been taken out of it. Sheriff Thorne's report was a masterpiece of careful language, full of what he didn't find. He didn't find any signs of a struggle. He didn't find any blood, any torn clothing, any evidence of a fight. He didn't find any notes or messages. He didn't find any footprints that weren't the staff's. The entire building was a clean, orderly crime scene with no crime to speak of. The only thing that was missing were the people themselves. He questioned Dr. Finch for hours, pushing him for any detail, any secret passage, any hidden weakness in the asylum's security. But Dr. Finch, a man who prided himself on his control, was just as baffled and terrified as everyone else. He insisted that the asylum was a fortress, impenetrable from the outside and inescapable from the inside. This led to the rumors. In a place where logical explanations fail, illogical ones begin to take root. The staff, traumatized by the event, started whispering about a ghost, a long-dead patient who had come back to lead the others away. Others spoke of a devil, a dark force that had manifested itself in the night and taken the souls of the weak and the sick. The most persistent rumor, however, was about a particular patient named Marcus Thorne. He was a brilliant but deeply troubled man who was obsessed with the asylum's architecture. He claimed to have found a secret, a weakness in the building's design, and he would spend hours drawing intricate, impossible maps of the asylum, maps that showed hidden passages and secret rooms that no one else could see. The staff dismissed him as a harmless eccentric, but after the vanishing, his drawings took on a new, chilling meaning. Was it possible that Marcus Thorne had found a way out, a secret path that no one else knew about, and had led the other patients to freedom? Or to something else? Grandpa and I found an old, faded copy of one of Marcus Thorne's drawings in a historical society's archives. It was a chaotic mess of lines and scribbles, but in the center, there was a detailed drawing of the asylum's clock tower, with a set of arrows pointing to a small, hidden door that no one had ever noticed before. The drawing had the words "The Passage to Silence" scrawled beneath it. It was a flimsy piece of evidence, a feverish drawing from a man who was deemed insane, but in the context of the vanishing, it felt like a bombshell. It was the only tangible clue, the only real lead, in a century-old mystery. The investigation was officially closed a few months after the vanishing, deemed an unsolvable mystery. Dr. Finch, his reputation in tatters, was forced to retire. The remaining patients were transferred to other facilities, and Elmwood Asylum was closed for good, its dark secrets locked within its stone walls. Over the years, the building fell into disrepair, its windows broken, its doors rotting, a crumbling testament to a tragedy that no one could explain. The story of the 53 patients faded from the headlines and became a local legend, a ghost story told around campfires. But for me, it was more than a ghost story. It was a human tragedy, a crime without a culprit, a mystery without a solution. I couldn't shake the image of that little hand-carved bird, left behind on the bed. It was a small, fragile thing, a piece of art made by a person who was forgotten by history. I wondered about its creator. Did they have a name? A family? Were they happy at Elmwood, or were they just biding their time, waiting for something? And what was it that took them away? Was it a passage to silence, as Marcus Thorne had drawn? Or was it something else, something even more terrifying and profound? The questions piled up in my mind, each one more insistent than the last. I knew then that I had to find out more. I had to go to Elmwood Asylum. I had to stand in those silent halls, to see those empty rooms, and to try to feel what the patients felt on that cold, foggy night so long ago. I had to follow the trail of 100-year-old whisper and try to find the truth, no matter how chilling it might be. The idea that a single drawing from a man labeled as insane could be the only real clue in a century-old mystery was all the push I needed. I couldn't just read about Elmwood Asylum anymore, I had to go there. My grandpa, of course, was hesitant at first. He warned me about the dangers of old, crumbling buildings, about weak floors and falling ceilings, but he also saw the fire in my eyes. He knew I wouldn't be satisfied with just the stories. So, with a flashlight, a sturdy pair of boots, and a healthy dose of fear, I convinced him to take me to Elmwood Hill. The drive there was as eerie as the legends had promised. The road that snaked its way up the hill was choked with weeds, and the surrounding trees were so thick and tangled they seemed to block out the sun, casting everything in a perpetual twilight. The air grew colder the higher we climbed, and a damp, earthy smell, the scent of decay and old secrets, hung in the air. We parked the car as close as we could to the old, rusted iron gates, which now hung open on a single, groaning hinge, a silent invitation to a place where no one should ever go. Elmwood Asylum stood before us, a grim, skeletal ruin against the gray sky. It was no longer a fortress, it was a ghost of one. The windows, once empty eyes, were now shattered black holes, and the dark stone walls were covered in a thick tapestry of ivy and moss, as if nature itself was trying to swallow the building whole, to bury its secrets once and for all. My heart was pounding in my chest like a drum as we stepped through the broken gates. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket broken only by the crunch of our boots on the gravel and the whisper of the wind through the tall, dry grass. We found the main entrance, a huge, arched doorway that now stood ajar, its heavy wooden doors warped and cracked. I took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of dust and damp stone, and stepped inside. The entrance hall was a cavernous, desolate space. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light that pierced a hole in the ceiling, illuminating a floor covered in a century's worth of grime and fallen plaster. I could see the grand staircase leading to the upper floors, its mahogany banister now rotting and covered in a fine layer of dust. The whispers from the past felt almost real here. I could almost hear the hurried footsteps of Dr. Finch, the quiet shuffle of nurses' shoes, the distant, mournful cries that had once filled these halls. But now, there was nothing. Just the silence. We began our search in the West Wing, where some of the missing patients had been housed. The hallways were long, dim, and lined with rotting wooden doors, some hanging open, others completely gone. The rooms were small, identical, and filled with a profound emptiness. A cot here, a small locker there, a single, barred window the same as in the old photographs. But it was in one of these rooms, a corner room on the second floor, that my flashlight beam caught something strange. It was a carving on the back of the door, a small, intricate drawing etched into the wood. It was a familiar symbol, a small, intricate drawing of the asylum's clock tower, with a set of arrows pointing to a small, hidden door that no one had ever noticed before. The same drawing from Marcus Thorne's sketch. The words "the passage to silence" were not there, but the drawing itself was unmistakable. My heart leapt into my throat. The drawing was real. It wasn't a feverish delusion of a madman. It was a clue, a real, tangible piece of evidence that had been hiding in plain sight for 100 years, overlooked by the official investigators. I ran my fingers over the carving, the wood rough and splintered, and felt a profound sense of connection to the patient who had made it. He was trying to tell someone something. He was trying to leave a message. We continued our search, now with a new sense of purpose. We had a map. We knew what we were looking for. We climbed the grand, groaning staircase to the upper floors, our flashlight beams sweeping across the crumbling walls and shattered windows. We searched the east wing, the north wing, and the south wing, looking for more clues, more drawings. We found nothing. It was as if that single drawing was the only piece of a larger puzzle, a single breadcrumb left on a trail that had long gone cold. But then we reached the very top of the asylum, the old clock tower. The stairs leading up to it were rickety and unsafe, and the air was thick with the smell of old wood and the cooing of pigeons that had made the tower their home. The clock tower room was a dark, dusty space, filled with the rusting gears and springs of the old clock. The air was cold, and the wind whistled through the shattered glass of the huge clock face, a mournful, haunting sound. My flashlight beam danced across the walls, a chaotic mess of peeling paint and water damage. But in one corner, half hidden behind a huge, rusting gear, I saw it. A small, square section of the stone wall was slightly darker, slightly less covered in moss and dirt than the rest. It looked as if it had been sealed up, long ago. My heart pounded. This had to be it. This had to be the passage to silence that Marcus Thorne had drawn. This had to be where the 53 patients went. My grandpa, seeing the look on my face, knew what I was thinking. He told me to be careful, that we shouldn't touch anything, that this was just a theory. But for me, it was more than a theory. It was the end of a long, lonely trail of 100 years of silence. It was a whisper that had finally been heard. We had to find a way to open it, to see what was behind the sealed wall, to finally understand the secret of Elmwood Asylum. We had to find out what happened to the 53 patients who vanished without a trace, and what they had left behind. The discovery of the sealed wall in the clock tower was more than a clue, it was a physical end to a century of silence. For me, it felt like the entire mystery of Elmwood Asylum, all the rumors, all the official reports, all the lost lives, was now condensed into that one small, hidden space. My heart was thumping in my chest, a frantic drum beat against the profound quiet of the ruin. My grandpa, ever the cautious paleontologist, was trying to talk me down, to convince me that we needed to be careful, that 100-year-old wall might not be safe. But I was beyond logic. I was fueled by a desperate need to know. We didn't have any tools with us, just my flashlight and a small, rusted crowbar we found lying in the dust of the clock tower. The wall wasn't made of the same heavy stone as the rest of the asylum. It was a patch of softer, crudely mortared stone, almost like a patch job. It was a deliberate covering, not a part of the original design. This confirmed my theory, someone had sealed this passage shut on purpose. We took turns with the crowbar, working a small crack into the mortar. The dust that flew up was thick and acrid, smelling of old stone and decay, a scent that felt like the breath of the asylum itself. It was slow, painstaking work. The crowbar would slip, and the stone would resist, but with every small chip of mortar we broke away, a new sense of possibility filled the air. Finally, with a groan and a shower of fine dust, a section of the wall gave way. Behind it was a small, dark opening, a space that was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It wasn't a room or a grand hall, it was just a passage, a narrow, claustrophobic tunnel of cold, damp stone. My flashlight beam cut through the absolute blackness, revealing a space choked with cobwebs and a layer of dust that had been undisturbed for 100 years. The air that rushed out was stale and heavy, with a faint, musty smell that made my stomach clench. My grandpa, to his credit, insisted on going first, his old body somehow still agile enough to slip through the narrow opening. I followed close behind, my heart still racing, my flashlight beam a small circle of light in a sea of darkness. The passage was not a simple, straight tunnel. It twisted and turned, following the inner curve of the clock tower, descending slowly with a series of uneven, ancient stone steps. The walls were rough to the touch, and I had to duck my head in some places to avoid hitting the low ceiling. The sound of our breathing was deafening in the silence, our footsteps a loud, crunching rhythm against the floor. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened up into a slightly larger space, a small, square chamber with no windows. The air was a little fresher here, and the silence was less suffocating. My flashlight beam swept across the room, and what I saw made me stop dead in my tracks. It wasn't a dungeon or a torture chamber. It was a library. Or at least, it had been a library. The room was lined with wooden shelves, but they were almost all empty. On a small, rotting wooden table in the center of the room, there was a single, leather-bound journal. Beside it, there was a neat stack of papers, all yellowed with age. And in the corner, a single, rusty metal chair. The scene was neat, almost impossibly so, for a place that had been forgotten for 100 years. My grandpa, his face a mixture of awe and fear, carefully picked up the journal. He blew the dust off the cover, revealing a faded name inscribed on the front, Marcus Thorne. My mouth went dry. This was it. This was the personal journal of the man who had drawn the map, the man who had been deemed insane. I had found him. Or at least, I had found his words. We opened the journal carefully, its pages so brittle they felt like they might crumble in our hands. The handwriting was neat and precise, but the words themselves were a window into a mind that was anything but. Marcus Thorne didn't write about his madness, he wrote about his genius. He wrote about the asylum's architecture, about the flaws and the hidden passages that no one else could see. He wrote about the asylum's true purpose, a dark secret that Dr. Finch had kept from the world. He called it the Project. According to the journal, Elmwood Asylum wasn't just a place to house the mentally ill. It was an experiment. Dr. Finch, obsessed with a twisted kind of scientific progress, believed that the human mind could be cleansed of its imperfections, of its madness, if it was subjected to a specific kind of sensory deprivation. He believed that if he could cut the patients off from all sound, all light, all human contact, he could essentially reset their minds. The hidden passage, Marcus Thorne's passage to silence, was not an escape route. It was the entrance to a series of small, soundproof chambers, designed to be the ultimate tool of sensory deprivation. And the 53 patients. They were the subjects of Dr. Finch's final, desperate experiment. According to Marcus Thorne's last entry, a few hours before the vanishing, Dr. Finch had gathered the 53 patients, the ones he believed were the most unresponsive to his other treatments, and had led them through the hidden passage, down into the silence. He had promised them a cure, a new beginning, a way out of their troubled minds. But Marcus Thorne, in his fragmented, brilliant way, saw the truth. He knew it was a one-way trip, a final, horrifying experiment. His final entry, scrawled in a frantic, desperate hand, was a plea to anyone who might one day find the chamber. He wrote, "I have tried to tell them, to warn them, but they cannot hear me. The silence has already begun. He has taken them all. They are gone to the darkness, where they will be erased, forgotten. But I have left this record. Let them not be forgotten. Let the world know what he has done. The truth was not a ghost, or a devil, or a mass escape. It was something far more chilling and real. It was the hubris of a man who believed he could play God, the quiet, methodical cruelty of a system that valued order over humanity. The 53 patients weren't abducted, they were led. They weren't killed, they were forgotten. Erased. Their last steps, their last whispers, their last thoughts were a part of a dark, forgotten experiment. And the silence I had felt on Elmwood Hill was not the silence of ghosts. It was the silence of forgotten lives, of a truth that had been locked away for 100 years, waiting for someone like me to find it. The silence that followed the final page of Marcus Thorne's journal was a heavy, suffocating thing. It wasn't the silence of an empty building, it was the silence of 100 years of hidden horror. My grandpa and I just stood there in the dusty, crumbling library, our flashlights illuminating the cruel words of the journal, the truth that had been locked away for a century. The weight of it all was almost too much to bear. 53 patients weren't just gone, they had been led to their own quiet, methodical end by a man who believed he was doing something good, something scientific. It was a kind of cruelty that was far more chilling than any ghost story. It was the cruelty of a man with a plan. We sat down on the cold, dusty floor, the journal laid open between us, and began to read it more closely, to try to understand the twisted logic of Dr. Finch. Marcus Thorne, for all his madness, had been an incredibly meticulous observer. He had a brilliant, if fragmented, mind that saw patterns and details that others missed. His journal wasn't just a record of his own thoughts, it was a chronicle of the asylum's final years, a terrifying window into the slow, quiet descent into darkness. He wrote about Dr. Finch's obsession with purifying the mind. Finch believed that mental illness was a kind of spiritual pollution, a cacophony of sound and thought that needed to be silenced. He believed that if he could cut the patients off from all sensory input, if he could create a state of absolute quiet, he could essentially reboot their minds, allowing them to be reborn in a state of perfect stillness. It was a horrific, Frankenstein-like idea, born not of malice, but of a twisted, scientific hubris. The first few pages of the journal were a detailed, almost loving description of the hidden passage itself. Marcus Thorne, a trained architect before his illness, had seen the structural flaws in the building's original design, a series of empty, unused spaces between the walls that could be repurposed. He had drawn a detailed map of these passages, and his journal was a guide to navigating them. He had even given them names, like the Whispering Hallway and the Path of Echoes. He wrote about how he would secretly explore these passages at night, a tiny, rebellious act of freedom in a place of confinement. But the entries for the last few months of 1933 were filled with a growing sense of dread. He wrote about Dr. Finch's changing behavior, about his increasingly frequent trips into the clock tower, about the sound of construction behind the sealed wall. He wrote about the fear in the other patients' eyes, the way they would huddle together in their wards, their whispers growing quieter, their songs fading. The 53 patients who vanished were not just any patients, they were the ones who had been at Elmwood the longest, the ones who had been deemed unresponsive by Dr. Finch. They were his final subjects, the ones he believed could only be cured by total erasure. The most chilling part of the journal was a list, a handwritten list of the 53 patients' names, their ages, and a small, personal detail about each one. Eleanor, age 42, always humming a song about a summer field. Thomas, age 21, loved to carve small birds out of wood. Mary, age 35, always asking for a pen and paper to write letters to a family she no longer had. This was it. This was the record of the lost, the human face of the vanishing. Dr. Finch had kept his own record, a list of experiments and theories, but this was a list of lives, of hopes, of dreams. Marcus Thorne had given them their names back. The journal also contained a series of detailed architectural drawings of the rest of the asylum, with a new path marked in red ink. This was it. This was the path to the Chambers of Silence. It led from the library, through a series of hidden passages, down into the deepest, darkest part of the asylum's foundation. It was a one-way trip, a passage into the very heart of Dr. Finch's dark experiment. Marcus Thorne had not been able to follow the other patients, but he had left a map for anyone who might one day find his journal. He had given us a way to continue the journey, to go into the silence and see what was left. We knew then what we had to do. The mystery was no longer a puzzle to be solved, it was a mission, a duty to the forgotten 53. We had to follow the red-inked path, to go down into the darkness and find the Chambers of Silence. We had to find out if anything was left, to see if Dr. Finch's experiment had left any trace of the lives it had taken. We had to find out if the silence was truly empty, or if it still held the echoes of those who had been erased. The asylum, once a ghost, now felt alive with a terrible, tragic energy. The ghosts were not in the halls, they were in the pages of a small, leather-bound journal, a journal that had just given us the key to finding them. The journey was not over. It was just beginning. We were going to follow the path of silence, and we were going to find the truth.